Welcome to the UPV Anti-Sexual Harassment Orientation. I'm Assistant Professor Anipat Alingasa Aguirre, the coordinator of the UPV Office of Anti-Sexual Harassment. In this lecture, we're going to cover the definition of sexual harassment and the pertinent policies of the UP system against sexual harassment. But first, let's discuss why we conduct regular anti-sexual harassment orientation. Let us remember that the anti-sexual harassment orientation is codal. Section 30 of the UP Anti-Sexual Harassment Code states that members of the UP community shall undergo an orientation on anti-sexual harassment once every 3 years, and that this orientation and clearance is a component of student curriculum and personal actions such as hiring, tenure and promotion, and accreditation of service contractors and partner entity engagements. So why did the university integrate this code as a requirement for tenure, promotion, clearance, and accreditation? So this declaration of policy is a materialization of the university's commitment to upholding the dignity of every individual, and the university guarantees the full respect for human rights of all members of the UP community. And so, all forms of sexual harassment are unacceptable. To this end, the university is committed to maintaining and enabling gender fair, safe, and healthy learning and working environments for the members of the UP community. To do so, we have regular biannual rollouts of the gender awareness and sensitivity orientation and the anti-sexual harassment orientations. These usually happen in the mid-year and at the start of the academic year. The regular rollouts of the GASA and the ASHA also show the university's recognition that preventing sexual harassment requires a collective commitment. It cannot be done by an office alone, by a person alone. Rather, everyone in the UP community should be committed to maintaining and enabling gender fair, safe, healthy learning and work environment for everyone. And as a collective commitment, this goes beyond our personal needs and conveniences. Now, in this orientation, we will cover three main topics: defining sexual harassment, identifying the types of sexual harassment, and discussing the UP ASH code. So to warm up, I'm going to show you a few situations, and please identify if the given situation can be considered as sexual harassment. Let's start with the case of Sarah. Sarah is a new employee at a marketing firm. Her boss, Mark, often comments on her appearance, saying things like, "You look good in that dress," or "I bet all the guys in the office are checking you out." He says that he means it as a compliment and leaves it at that. He also stands very close to her when they talk and sometimes touches her shoulder or back. Sarah feels uncomfortable, but she doesn't say anything because she doesn't want to make a scene or lose her job. Is this sexual harassment? I'll give you a few seconds to think. And the answer is yes, it's sexual harassment because Sarah feels uncomfortable with the way that Mark comments on her appearance and with the way that he touches her shoulders and back. Next, let's look at the case of Vanessa. Vanessa visited the company's health services unit due to a persistent headache. The company nurse asked Vanessa about her last menstrual period and whether she was actually or sexually active. Vanessa answered that she was a virgin. The company nurse then asked Vanessa to take a pregnancy test before the doctor can prescribe her any medicine. The nurse said, "You just really need to give me proof that you're not pregnant, because I've had people lie to us before about not being sexually active." The nurse also said that it's hard to believe that Vanessa was still a virgin at her age. Vanessa was extremely offended at the remarks of the nurse. So, is this sexual harassment? The answer is yes. And the defining moment that makes this situation a form of sexual harassment is because Vanessa was extremely offended by the unnecessary remarks of the nurse about her lack of sexual activity. And so, even though the nurse is required to perform a routine medical procedure, she could have proceeded with this particular procedure in a more respectful way. Now, let's move on to the last case. This one, we have the case of Neha and Raul, who both work on the same floor of their company. They occasionally pass each other in the halls or during breaks. They're at least professionally acquainted, even friendly at times. One day in the break room, Raul politely compliments Neha, saying, "Your hair looks great today." She says, "Thanks." Raul then politely asks her if she'd like to join him for a drink after work so they can get to know each other. Is this sexual harassment? The answer is, at this point, no. Neha did not express any discomfort, so let's say Neha politely refuses Raul. The next day, Raul once again asks her if she wants to have coffee. Neha refuses him again, and Raul repeatedly asks for the next 2 weeks, which makes Neha frustrated and annoyed. She does not appreciate the gesture, and she states that she doesn't want to go out with Raul for coffee. In this scenario, we see that Raul has become persistent to the point that it has frustrated and annoyed Neha. And in this case, we have a case of sexual harassment. So, from our examples previously, we learned that sexual harassment is any unwanted, unwelcome, uninvited behavior of a sexual nature, or inappropriate sexual advances, or offensive remarks about a person's sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So remember that for any act to count as sexual harassment, it has to be sexual in nature. So punching someone is not sexual in nature. However, touching someone, especially touching their private parts, is sexual in nature. And key to this particular definition of sexual harassment is that sexual harassment is any unwanted behavior and it's any offensive behavior. So sexual harassment, therefore, is any sexual conduct that is unwelcome and pervasive. And we can see that in the example of Raul and Neha. What's more, sexual harassment as conduct that is unwelcome and pervasive is something that creates an intimidating, hostile, or humiliating environment for the recipient. That is, because the sexual act is unwanted and persistent, it creates an environment of fear and anxiety. It creates an environment that's humiliating for the recipient. And now we have just presented two key features of sexual harassment. First, it's any sexual act that's unwanted. Second, it's any sexual act that creates a hostile environment. Third, sexual harassment is any sexual act that's done without a person's consent. And consent simply means agreement, saying yes to something. So when a person consents to a request, it means that they said yes to a request. This consent cannot be given by individuals who are underage, intoxicated or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep or unconscious. So far, we have discussed three key features that make any sexual behavior an act of sexual harassment. First, it's unwanted. Second, it creates a hostile environment. And third, it's done without a person's consent. Now, what's important to understand is sexual harassment is an exploitation of power. It involves an abuse of power or authority. It dehumanizes and diminishes its victims. And power can come from several sources. Power can come from institutional authority, and this is referred to as ascendancy, or the occupation of a position of dominant power or influence. Power can also come from gender. Statistics show that there are more men than women who are perpetrators of sexual harassment, and there are more women who are victims of sexual harassment than men. Power can also come from socioeconomic status, as consent cannot be given by individuals who are underage, intoxicated or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep, and anonymity can also be a source of power. Freedom walls have become very popular nowadays, and because freedom walls are anonymous, People can just say whatever they want about another person's appearance, another person's sexual life. They even share their sexual escapades in these public platforms. Sexual harassment can be an abuse of power or authority, which we refer to as ascendancy. And in the cases of ascendancy, sexual harassment can be misogynistic and sexist remarks, but they can also be a request or a demand for a sexual favor by that person of authority. And this demand for a sexual favor can be in exchange for appointments, grades, or grants. And the sexual favor can also be set as a term and condition for appointments, grades, and grants. So here's another example of sexual harassment that involves ascendancy. And in this particular case, we have a 16-year-old girl, Mulin, who was groomed by her high school teacher, Mr. Morales. What I would like you to notice is Mulin's struggle. She couldn't call Morales' actions as abusive because she felt that she had somewhat consented to his advances. What I would like you to note, so Mulin struggled to believe that she had been harassed because she felt that she consented to that particular relationship. But let us remember that in cases of ascendancy, sexual harassment is still deemed to exist, regardless of whether that act or that series of acts were accepted by the offended party. So even if Mullen believed that she consented to Mr. Morales' advances, because this is a case of grooming and, moreover, most importantly, because this is a case of ascendancy and abuse of authority, regardless of whether Mullen consented, there is still sexual harassment involved. And the Ash Code also recognizes that sexual harassment can happen among peers, and that it can also be committed by a subordinate against a superior. Now, let's move on to the types of sexual harassment. So there are three types of sexual harassment. We have verbal sexual harassment, visual and online sexual harassment, and physical sexual harassment. Starting with verbal sexual harassment. So I believe that many of us are familiar with the case of the trans woman who went viral because she forced a wait staff to stand in parade position for 2 hours because this wait staff addressed her as sir. So indeed, this trans woman was at fault for abusing the wait staff. At the same time, Filipino netizens uh, called her out for what she did in a in a very transphobic way. For example, this trans woman, in response to all the bashing that she received online, said, "Stop calling me sir." But this particular vlogger, Kiko Matos TV, shared Jude Bacalso's post and said, "Kopya brother." So in this situation, we can witness verbal sexual harassment in the form of transphobic slurs and homophobic slurs. People also were persistent in telling sexual jokes and using sexual names. People also invaded the privacy of this trans woman because they stalked her social media accounts, they found out where she worked, and they found out many personal details about her life. Finally, this particular this particular case also involves the impersonation of identities of victims online or posting lies to harm their reputation because many social media netizens uh, made dummy accounts of this particular trans woman. They pretended to be her and they shared derogatory posts while pretending to be her. Here's another example of verbal sexual harassment. And in this case, we witness persistent or invited comments or gestures about a person's appearance and unwanted invitations.